Hi birders, it's Joe the Springbrook birder for the DuPage Birding Club. I'm out at Springbrook Prairie again, a place where I do most of my birding, but this time I'm over by the creek in a wooded area. Well, it certainly doesn't look like much of a prairie here, but this is a good spot to find a lot of migrating birds in a couple months, when all the warblers and vireos are around and they're migrating through. They like the creek and the woods, so it's a good spot to try and find them. Some of the videos that have been produced by the DuPage Birding Club have been by my good friend Dennis Kanya, and he has done a large number of tutorials that give you pointers and tips on how to separate and identify a lot of species. Now, Dennis is a very visual birder, and so most of his tips are based on the differences in plumage and key field marks that you can find on birds. And of course, if you're looking for those field marks, you have to be able to see the birds. And a lot of times in the spring, after the leaves come out, you're looking for that warbler in the top of a tree, and it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to find those little marks that Dennis talks about. Now, there's another way to identify birds without binoculars, and that's why I named this video Birding Without Binoculars. And that's by identifying birds by the calls they make, whether it's their chip notes or calls or songs or other vocalizations. You can identify birds by their calls. And in that case, you don't need all of Dennis's real great field mark information. You can identify them just by hearing them. And that's called birding by ear. And birding by ear is very useful. It's another tool for identification. And again, it's something that you can learn, and we're going to talk about that today. Now, the reason you can identify birds by their calls and sounds is that most birds have unique calls, just like they have unique plumages. They also have unique calls and sounds. So once you get familiar with those sounds and with the bird calls, you can do a pretty good job of identifying them. And again, you don't even have to see them. So today we're going to start out here by talking about a number of basics on bird communication. That's going to be part one of the video. I'll talk about why we can identify birds, why birds have different calls and songs and some of the differences there. So I'll give you a basic introduction to birding by ear. Then in part two of the video, we'll talk about specifics on identifying birds by ear. What are some of the things you have to learn? How can you learn them? What are some of the key aspects of bird calls and songs? So that's going to be in part two. So right now, here at Springbrook, it's really quiet. It's the middle of winter time, as you can see by all the snow and ice. And there's not much calling and certainly nothing singing right now. So it's very quiet. But just wait a couple months and these woods will be full of bird songs and calls. So now is a really good time to try and identify those. Right about now, the only thing I'm hearing is some of the gurgling and tinkling of the ice in this little creek here that stays open because of springs that are in the creek. That's probably why they call this place Springbrook Creek. Anyway, so we're going to go ahead and start part one of the video, and we'll see you later. So that was a song of the hermit thrush, one of my favorite bird songs. I recall hearing them sing in some mature maple hemlock forests of northeastern Connecticut in the early morning dawn. and it was always a very moving experience. Not only did I enjoy hearing that wonderful song, I also immediately knew that the bird making that sound was a male hermit thrush singing to establish and maintain his territory. Knowing bird calls and songs is an extremely useful and valuable skill to learn. I think it is also an easier task today than it was when I started birding. Back then, resources available to birders were very limited. In fact, here was about the only tool available: a set of 2 vinyl records, a field guide to the bird songs by Roger Torrey Peterson. Of course, you needed a record player, and you had to place the needle on the correct track to find a bird that you were interested in hearing. It was not very portable, but it was the best there was back then. Well, enough historical birding. Let's get started on how to learn to be a great birder by ear and by identifying birds without binoculars. We will start out with some basics about communication in birds, and particularly communications by sound. First, birds communicate to other birds, whether it be individuals of their own species or other species, through both sight and sound. The colorful plumages that we see and use to identify birds by sight evolved over time to communicate with other birds, not to be an ease in identifying them. Birds also communicate through sound. Similarly to identifying a bird by what it looks like, we as birders can also identify a bird by what it sounds like. Almost all birds communicate through sounds, including calls, chip notes, and songs. Some communicate through non-vocal sounds, such as the drumming of woodpeckers, bill clattering, and even sounds made by their wings or feathers. As an example, here is the sounds of the snipe. That sound is made by the male snipe when he's doing his courtship flights. And it's not a vocal sound. The sound is made as the bird is flying and wind goes through the tail of the bird. So there's an example of feather sounds. And most species have unique sounds. So like the field marks of plumages, birders can use those species-specific sounds to identify them. So why are birds so vocal? As I indicated, sounds provide auditory signals to other birds, either their own species or other species. Bird sounds primarily serve as a function in breeding, predator avoidance, or even coordination of a flock. Sound communication developed in birds to fill a biological need. It is only a very fortuitous coincidence that birders can use them as well. Birds have many different ways of communicating through sound, depending on the circumstances and their needs. There are songs, chip notes or calls, flock calls, flight calls, alarm calls, and even non-vocal sounds. The most important for birders are songs and call notes. Of the variety of sounds that birds can make, songs are the most valuable in terms of bird identification. Songs can be defined as relatively long and conspicuous vocalizations that generally are made from perches, although some birds give their songs during flight. Birds primarily use their songs to defend their territories or attract mates. So each species song is unique, which makes them an excellent identification tool for birders. Here in DuPage County, it is almost always the male birds that do the singing, but in some species, female birds also sing. Finally, since bird song is closely tied to mating and nesting, songs are heard during spring migration and the nesting season. As a group, songbirds, officially Aussians in the scientific classification of birds, make up nearly half of all the more than 10,000 species of birds worldwide. Ornithologists have discovered that while there are some instinctive or genetic components to bird song, young birds primarily learn the details of their song from their parents. Bird calls, on the other hand, or chip notes, are shorter, simpler, and more variable vocalizations than songs. Calls are not likely to play a key role in the nesting cycle and can be given throughout the year. Calls function as communications between and among bird species, to maintain communications between pairs or flocks of birds, serve as predator alarm calls, and are even given at night as birds are migrating. Many calls are distinctive and also can be used to identify birds in the field. To provide an example of the difference between songs and calls, here is a song of the very familiar bird, the American robin. And now the call notes of the American robin. Note how the song is longer and has many more components to it. Bird calls are shorter, sharper, and oftentimes more variable than its song. As another example, here is a song of the bobolink. The bobolink often gives its song during flight. And examples of the call notes of bobolink. In both cases, I think that the robin song and the bobolink song, as well as its calls, are distinctive. Once you get to learn them, once you hear those calls, you know what bird they are coming from. So that was an introduction to birding by ear. It gives you some basic information on bird vocalizations. In part 2 of the video, I'll talk more specifically on how to learn bird calls and songs and how you can incorporate your birding by ear skills into all your birding activities. For then, this is Joe, the Springbrook birder for the DuPage Birding Club. And remember, bird with a purpose.